Welcome to the Paraprofessional Training Series. For each webinar, you can access handouts by clicking on the link in the Webinar Handouts box. Before you begin, please pause now to download or print the handouts that will be used for this part of the series. This is Part 4 of the Paraprofessional Training Series. This webinar will address the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, eligibility categories, and student supports. This is a multi-part series offered for paraprofessionals. Verification of orientation training necessary for each paraprofessional to perform duties as assigned is present. The federal regulations, the Missouri State Plan, and the Missouri Office of Special Education Compliance Standards and Indicators indicate that each paraprofessional, even those who hold a teaching certificate, is required to receive 15 clock hours of training within 6 months of hire, including orientation and initial training prior to working with the student. A minimum of 10 clock hours for each school year thereafter is also required. The purpose of Part 4 in this webinar series is to introduce some frequently used acronyms, develop a basic understanding of the special education process, become familiar with how students are found eligible for special education services, and to discuss how to support students with whom you work. Please take a moment to make sure you have the handouts listed in the screen available for your use throughout the webinar. During the course of this training, you will be directed to pause the webinar to review and reflect on content or activities using these handouts. Once you have completed these activities, click play and continue with the roles and responsibilities portion of this webinar. We will talk about some basics of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, process. This portion of the webinar will address how students become eligible for or qualify for special education and related services. It is important to remember that IDEA is a federal law that provides free and appropriate public education to students who qualify. The state of Missouri and your district also write a plan to comply with IDEA. There are several laws that govern the services that students receive. In 1975, the first law providing students with disabilities a public education was passed. Since that time, the law has changed names and been reauthorized under Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The Every Student Succeeds Act reauthorizes the 50-year-old Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. The nation's national education law and long-standing commitment to equal opportunity for all students. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act is a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records. The law applies to all schools that receive funds under an applicable program of the U.S. Department of Education. The American with Disabilities Act became law in 1990. It is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. To be noted, the American with Disabilities Act, ADA, is frequently used by students as they transition to a post-secondary setting. The first step in the process of a student qualifying for special education services is a referral for evaluation to determine eligibility for special education services. The referral may come from anyone in the agency or school. A parent or guardian may also make a request for evaluation. Once the parent request is made, it must be acted upon because mandated timelines go into effect. If a parent expresses a concern to you about their student, immediately report it to your direct supervisor. After a referral is received, a multidisciplinary team may conduct a review of existing data, RED, to determine if further information is necessary. If further information is necessary, the multidisciplinary team will determine the information needed and obtain parental consent to evaluate. The evaluation must be completed within 60 calendar days of receiving signed parental consent to evaluate. In the next section of this webinar, we will briefly discuss the 16 specific eligibility categories as defined by IDEA and Missouri State Plan for Special Education. Based on evaluation data, a team of qualified educational professionals and the parent or guardian must determine if the student meets eligibility criteria. When a determination is made that a student meets eligibility criteria and needs special education, an Individualized Education Program, IEP, must be developed for the student in accordance with the Missouri State Plan. Take a moment to read through the 16 eligibility categories. Remember, you may pause the webinar at any time to make sure you have enough time to process any information on the slides. As mentioned in the previous section, a student must be evaluated and meet one of the 16 eligibility categories listed on this slide. There are very specific criteria involved, which are mandated under federal and state law. Not every student who may need additional help or has a medical diagnosis will be eligible under IDEA. Now that we have had some discussion about the special education process and how students are found eligible for services under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, let's do an activity using some of the most frequent eligibility categories and some general characteristics of the students with whom you may work. Find handout 1A and handout 1B. You will not cut handout 1A. Pause the webinar, take handout 1B and cut it apart on the lines. Mix them up and match them with the student eligibility categories on handout 1A. This is intended to help us understand how to interact and help support each student as an individual. Please pause the webinar now and take time to complete the activity. When you have completed the matching activity, start the webinar again. Please check your answers with what is on the slide. Please check your answers with what is on the slide. Now that we have some knowledge about the IDEA process and eligibility categories, let's take some time to discuss some of the supports students may require. We must remember that each student and their brain works differently. We cannot think about a one-size-fits-all method for each student with an IEP. The I in IEP means individualized. Each student's program will look different based upon their needs. The IEP has two general purposes. First, it is to set reasonable learning goals for a child. And second, it identifies the services the school district will provide for the child. A free, appropriate public education, FAPE or FAPE, means services are provided at no cost to the parent. Least restrictive environment, LRE, means the supports and services are provided in the general education classroom as much as possible. All students, including a student with an IEP, are considered general education students first. This means all students will take state assessments, work on goals related to the Missouri learning standards, and follow the district and school discipline plan. Only a student who has been found eligible will have an individual education program, IEP. An IEP is a legal document that must be followed as written. Paraprofessionals must implement the IEP under the direction of a certified teacher. The IEP is reviewed annually and must be followed as written. Included in the IEP will be the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, goals, related services, accommodations and/or modifications, and time for services and supports. Related services are part of the student's IEP. Related services may be required in order for the student to benefit from special education. For some students, that might include physical therapy, occupational therapy, adaptive physical education, assistive technology, and speech or language services. However, this is not an exhaustive list of related services. It is important that you are familiar with the terms accommodations and modifications. Students with an IEP may have accommodations or modifications. If applicable, a paraprofessional may be involved in providing the accommodations or modifications under the supervision of the certified teacher. An evaluation is conducted to determine eligibility under federal and state guidelines. An individual education program, IEP, is developed by a team of qualified educational professionals and parents or guardians. IEPs are implemented as written. At this point in the webinar, we will now walk through some of the most frequently used acronyms that may be used in your classrooms and discussions. Take a few minutes to think about the special education acronyms and words that go with them. If you are doing this webinar with others, discuss among yourselves and gather answers and ideas on what the acronyms might mean. Pause the webinar now for this activity. Once you have completed this activity, resume the webinar. These are just a few of the acronyms that are frequently used in special education. While there are many more, this is a good start. As you begin your work as a paraprofessional, remember to ask questions if you are unfamiliar with an acronym. Developing an understanding of the special education process, becoming familiar with how students are found eligible for special education services, and discussing what supports students may receive are important for the understanding of the special education eligibility process. Take a few minutes to locate and complete handout number 2. Missouri has been split into 9 regions. Each region has a Regional Professional Development Center, RPDC. The diverse staff of the RPDC provides a variety of professional development opportunities and services for K-12 schools, both on and off campus. Each of these centers have staff trained in paraprofessional professional development. Please contact your teacher or leader and your supervisor for access to the resources available through these centers. This concludes Part 4 of the Paraprofessional Training Series.